I want to thank you for this great opportunity, Professor Kretzer, Mr. Kretzer, Governor of Victoria. What a wonderful building and a great opportunity to be here. I am podium phobic, so I will apologize to you if you can't see me, but I'm more comfortable here, so I'll talk from here. As was said before, my name is Shai Agassi. I'm the founder and CEO of Better Place. I'm an Imagineer. I imagine the future and engineer towards it. And a lot of people have this tendency to do engineering forward, in which case we're bound by what we see around us. And a lot of people tend to do imagining, which is sort of I've been blamed to be only imagining, which is sort of the Disney thing, is hope for the best and it will happen. And I don't believe in either. I don't believe in imagining without engineering, and I don't believe with engineering just within the constraints of what we do today. You have to have both if you want to solve big problems, and you can't apply the methods that got us into trouble to getting us out of trouble. We're very lucky to have a situation today where we have created a glorious disaster. We have the entire planet climate changing on us at speeds that we have not seen before. We are running out of oil. The entire car industry is falling apart. The economy's in a global recession. Jobs are short. And it's such a great opportunity because you can't solve one of these elements and ignore the other ones. We cannot solve for the car industry by creating more cars of the past. That won't work. We cannot solve climate by destroying the economy even more. We can't save the economy but then destroy the planet, because 10 years from now, what good would it do us? So we have to start thinking in holistic ways, and we have to start asking ourselves the real big, tough questions. And we have to solve for them at scale. It's not good enough to go build one electric car. It's not good enough to build one beautiful green building. We have to start asking the real big questions. So I got tackled with an enormous question, one of those open-ended conversational starters you shouldn't throw at a 40-year-old because they create a midlife crisis. How are you going to make the world a better place by 2020? Open-ended, but limited in time. And I came back from that question at a World Economic Forum in 2005 with another question in my mind. How would you run an entire country without gasoline, but without altering the way we live? Not by forcing people not to drive, but not by changing the way we build cities, but in a way that is pragmatic, based on the science that we have off the shelf, not in some lab, in some research somewhere down the road, without inventing new economics, and working within the confines of consumer tastes as we know them today. How would you run an entire country without gasoline? It took me the better part of 2 years to come up with an answer. I went down every possible mistake. I started thinking it will be biofuels. And I ran through 6 months of assessing every possible biofuels and realizing at the end of the day, with all the incentives and everything that was put in places like the US, for example, we generate 5 days worth of driving from biofuels, and the other 360. You know how we say there are 360 days in a year? It's the other 5 that we do with biofuels, and the other 360 we did with oil. And that's with massive investments to the tune of about $90 billion over the last 5 years. And realizing that in this case it just doesn't scale. I went down hydrogen. I was absolutely positively sure it will be hydrogen. Only to realize that that's probably the stupidest idea ever invented by mankind. You take an electron, you pack it with a proton that's 2,000 times bigger, you send it all the way to the car, you build a whole new infrastructure at hundreds of billions of dollars, only to strip the proton from the electron and use the electron at the car. That's not a smart idea given the fact that we've built the grid, man's greatest accomplishment, that actually knows how to send the electron without the proton. In that case, why do you pack it? And that brought me to the idea that actually the only way to do it is by going directly to electrons. And you need to build an electric car, an infrastructure that will solve the issue for an electric car. That created our base hypothesis. In other words, we translated the question, how do you run an entire country without gasoline, to the following hypothesis. It will sound almost stupid, in its simplicity. But interestingly enough, nobody's ever answered that hypothesis before. If you will give consumers, as they come to the car dealership, a car that is more convenient than a gasoline car, that costs less than a gasoline car, by and large, they will buy it. At which point, they will be willing to pay the same amount of money per kilometer to drive that car as gasoline, as petrol, in the station. Now, everybody goes like this, sounds logic, yet every attempt in the past has gone against that hypothesis. We figured out the car is limited by the size of the battery. As a result of the fact that it's limited by the size of the battery, let's build a small car that will be a bit lighter. Let's give up 2 seats, make it tiny, sort of like a golf cart, only with roof. And then it has limited range to drive, but because we put the battery inside and we make a small number of them, it will cost $40,000, $50,000. And so we asked the consumer to go buy a car that is less convenient and costs more. Then we got surprised by the fact that they just didn't do it. Very few of them did, and we got surprised by the fact that there was no adoption, which was proof to the fact that everybody wants to buy oil. Hence, we got to stay on oil. We came back with the exact opposite set of questions. How would you make a car battery, much like the one that's depleting from my jacket? Sorry. How would you go in the car that goes on a battery that's limited by today's science to about 120 miles, 100 to 120 miles, that would still be more convenient than a gasoline car? As you can see, this is a fractal of questions that we started to unfold over the last 4 years. And we found out that the answer is actually in infrastructure. Much like every solution that we know today that we use on a day-to-day basis, the answer comes in the form of infrastructure. We didn't start with Google. We started with fiber in the ground. We didn't start with cell phones. We started with towers. We didn't start with cars. We started with gas stations before major adoption has happened. And so when you start thinking about it, why would we get a new form of transportation to be the prevailing form of transportation without any infrastructure to support it in the ground before we start? Now, we know the limitations on that car. We figured out you need to be able to create more convenience than gasoline car. And so the definition of convenience came to us in the form of the opposite of inconvenience. When you buy a car, you want to drive it all the time, everywhere you go. Otherwise, you would use a bus or a train. The only inconvenient moment you have is going into a gas station, filling up your car with petrol. Is it petrol or gasoline here? Petrol. You fill it up with petrol. How many times do you do that? When you ask most drivers, they'll tell you roughly about once a week. And so the magic number is 50 times a year. When you ask them how long does it take you to go through the gas station, the petrol station, they'll tell you about 5 minutes. That's a lie. It's about 7 to 8 minutes, but we forget the entry, the exit, the credit card, and the ice cream moment, because those are good moments. They're not bad moments. And so we remember 5 minutes 50 times a year. And that became our bar. We have to create a car that will stop for less than 50 times a year in less than 5 minutes. On a battery that can take you about 120 miles, about 200 kilometers, 160 to 200 kilometers. And we came out with an answer. I won't go into all the details, but it actually is a dual strategy to bring energy into your car. The first is the longest extension cable on Earth. It connects the grid that brings electricity to your home and your work and to downtowns everywhere to the parking lot. It's the last foot that was missing. In a sense, wherever we park a car, we will have a charge spot. So that when you stop your car, you plug your car in, and when you come back to your car, magic happens. It's always full. It's not a very high-end magic because it's called the socket. We've seen it in the home. It's a very secure one. We make sure that kids can't get electrons into their body using the same cable, and we make sure that we know how to flatten the curve on loading so that when all the cars plug in at 8 o'clock in the morning, lights still stay on in the building because we flatten the curve and who gets to charge when. But by the end of the day, what we created is an edge to the existing grid that makes sure we can charge all cars so that when you come back to your car, it is always full. Imagine that contract with BP or Chevron or Exxon, that whenever you park your car, there'll be a truck that will zoom in and fill you up. That would be a good contract, right? That means we need to solve for the other situation, the exception, which is the long drive. The drive that I go more than 200 kilometers and I don't want to stop and charge for about 2 hours, which is what today's electric vehicles have asked you to do. Because if you stop and charge for an hour or 2 hours, that's a bus ride, that's not a car ride. If you do it every 200 kilometers, it's annoying. And if it's annoying, it's not convenient, and so you will not even consider buying that car. And so we figured out the second way to put energy into the car is to switch the battery. We actually took that technology from about 2 centuries ago. When you wanted to take a horse ride from one place to another, you would go on the carriage, your horses would ride really, really fast, you would get to a stop, they'll switch the horses, and you keep going, instead of feeding them and waiting for about 4 or 5 hours for them to rest so that they can keep going. And so what we figured out is we need to switch the battery. How do you switch the battery? You come into a station, it looks like car wash, your depleted battery goes out, a full battery comes in, and you keep driving. That machine, which we imagined 2 years ago, has actually been engineered and demonstrated in Japan 2 months ago, and the amount of time it takes to do that entire switch, entry to exit, is 40 seconds. You sit in your car, your dashboard becomes a retail spot so you can order your sandwich and your bottle of Coke, and when you come out, a minute later, you're on the road again. So if you want to go 600 kilometers, you need to do 2 stops. They'll take you 2 minutes. It's actually shorter than the one gas station. And if you're driving with kids, you'd actually need to stop at least 2 more times for the other tank we can't take care of. In other words, we have given you more convenience than gasoline. How often would you stop to switch the battery? Probably 10, 15 times a year. Less than the number of times you will stop for gas. It's the times you will drive more than 200 kilometers one stop, non-stop. How many minutes would you spend? Less than 5. The combination of the two, charge spots plus gas stations, costs roughly the same amount of money to build for a country or a region as gas stations used to cost for cars. In other words, the cost of distribution of energy is less than the cost of distribution for petrol today. So we got convenience. How about the price of the car? One of the things that we've done is we've taken the price of the battery off the car. It's not your battery. In effect, it's a mini crude oil well that gets consumed over time. It's a consumable component, not a component of the car. And without that component, the cost of an electric car, bill of material today, roughly around $12,000, $13,000. Logistics, advertising, marketing, dealer's margin, you name it, those cars will be roughly in the $20,000 US dollars range, which by the time 2012 we launch across Australia, I would assume that it would be less than 20,000 Australian dollars, given the currency fluctuations around the world. With that in mind, we actually have a very interesting car. Not only that, most countries around the world have created an incentive plan to get manufacturing to high volume, because we're starting from absolute zero in a market that makes about 50 to 70 million cars a year. And so to create an incentive to generate the first cars in the world that go electric, governments around the world have put an incentive plan in place. I'll give you a few examples. France, 5,000 euro per electric car. US, $7,500. China, $9,000. Japan, about $10,000. UK, about 5,000 pounds. Every country created a different incentive plan. In some cases, it's a bonus to the guy who buys the car. In some cases, they put a tax if you picked the wrong car. The ultimate tax system was the Danish one. If you buy an electric car, no tax. If you buy a gasoline car, a petrol car, 180% tax. In other words, if you want a sedan in Denmark, it will cost you about $50,000 to buy, $55,000 to buy the sedan. If you want an electric sedan, it's about $20,000 to buy. And it's sort of an IQ test. They want you to move to Norway if you pick the wrong car. So we created a more convenient car that is actually cheaper to build. We didn't build the car. We don't make the car. We went out to the car companies around the world, and the first one to pick up on this idea is Renault. Renault came up and originally thought this would be a great experiment. Roughly about 3,000 cars a year in Israel. That was the first country that said, let's go do it. There's a great story behind that, and I'll tell you that in a second. But they thought it's going to be 3,000, 4,000 cars at best in Israel. That's the amount of cars they sell every year in Israel, Renault cars they sell in Israel. Once they realized the pricing model and the price differentiation, it is now a car that's slated to sell about 150,000 in the next 3-4 years. The second car, the upgraded version, is already planned to sell more than 1 million cars in the first 5 years. And it's the first mass-produced electric car in history. What does it mean mass-produced? It went through the entire cycle of production, through the entire industry, sourced from various different places. All the components are made in mass production, in high volume, and the first car was actually put together about a month ago, and we drove it. It drives twice faster than its sister, gasoline sister. It has acceleration that is actually pretty dangerous for most young drivers. It has absolute top torque. Torque is what you feel when you get planted into your seat at 0 kilometers an hour as you press the pedal. It makes no noise, so we're going to download drive tones into it. You'll be able to pick the sound of your car. Imagine driving a Renault car but making the sound of a Ferrari. That will cost you more per kilometer, by the way. But you're able to create a new experience with that car, one that is better and cheaper and more convenient than today's cars. So we're coming to the last question in this entire equation. If you're willing to buy a cheaper car that is more convenient and pay only what you pay for gasoline, can we fit the cost of the battery and the electrons and still make some margin for the people who give you the infrastructure? The new electric kilometer company. You see, when you go to a petrol station, you don't buy petrol. None of you collects petrol at home. There's no petrol tasting competition. We buy kilometers. We buy 400, 500, 600 kilometers every time we go into a petrol station. We got addicted the day we bought this shiny object with 4 wheels. And we buy kilometers at whatever price they ask us. Remember last summer, we went into the petrol station, the price was what? $1.50 a liter? Anybody here complain with the attendant that it was much higher than they used to be and they're not willing to pay that price? Do you know how much fluctuation in kilometers happened in Australia during the summer of '08? Less than 1%. There is no substance in the world that has higher addiction. If somebody raises the price on Coca-Cola by a factor of 3, we'll switch out. Even milk, we'll switch out. Water, we'll switch out. Petrol, we're stuck. Why? Because petrol has the biggest monopoly on earth. 99.9% of cars in the world can only take liquid molecules to drive. And the option is not to buy it or not to buy it. The option is to get to work or not get to work. And so as a result of that, what we do is we drive, we pay about $4 or $5 more at the peak of price, and we stop buying Starbucks to compensate. The alternative between driving and not driving becomes the alternative between driving and not buying something else. And as a result of that, economies collapse. How much so? In the aggregate, the G20, in the last 12 months, have saved $1.5 trillion on oil imports, which just happens to be the exact amount of money put in the G20's collective stimulus packages. Oil, the economy. Oil, the economy. That's the equation we have right now. Now, let's look at the cost of electric driving. The cost of the battery divided by the amount of kilometers it could drive, roughly about 400,000 kilometers per battery pack, plus the cost of clean electrons, only clean electrons, windmills or solar, to create absolute zero carbon footprint to drive these cars, is $5 US per kilometer. Sorry, 5 US cents per kilometer. I apologize. I keep doing the same thing. It's US dollar cents per kilometer. 5 cents a kilometer, US dollar cent per kilometer, multiplied by about 12 kilometers per liter, is roughly 60 cents per liter. Anybody here knows where to find 60 cents liter? Now here's the interesting number. That 5 cent in 2011 numbers becomes 3 cents in 2015, becomes 1.5 cents in 2020. Much like any consumer electronic device, it goes down a curve which cuts in half every period of time. The historic curve has been half every 4 to 5 years. And so the price in 2020 is 1.5 US cent per kilometer. Let's assume technologies on the car side improve roughly the same way they did before. By the way, I don't know if you know, efficiency in Australia over the last decade improved by 1%. Not per annum, per decade. So let's assume we go 40, 50, 60, 70% better on kilometers. We go to 20 kilometers a liter on all cars in Australia. At 1.5 cents, we need to look for a 30-cent liter at the petrol station in 2020. Anybody wants to take bets? Now, what does that mean? It means that there is a huge margin somewhere between now and 2020 on a per kilometer basis. And now comes the interesting part. That huge margin is roughly in the tune of about 10 to 12 to 13 cents per kilometer. There will be a day you will go into a petrol station to change batteries, but when you go buy the car, before you go into the petrol station, they'll ask you, how many years do you want to lock your price? Per kilometer or per month? And if you'll say 6 years, or 5 years, or 7 years, depending on the car you choose, they'll give you the car for free. How many of you want to buy a gasoline car right now? How many of you think they can sell that car in 3-4 years' time? See, that's the amazing thing about this industry. If you don't think you can sell a car, you don't buy it. And if you don't think you can sell a car 4 or 5 years out, and you don't buy it, car companies should stop designing them 5 years ago. It's a very long range industry. A car that will start design today will only be on the road in 4 years' time and will actually only be sold, because it will be leased for the first 3 years, in 7 or 8 years' time. In other words, anybody who looks at the car industry needs a crystal ball that is 8 years long. Anybody here wants to bet that a free electric car will lose to a petrol car in 8 years' time? That's the wrong bet to take. The threat of such a change in the industry impacts globally a collective industry of cars and petrol and all the ancillary businesses around it, from insurance to radio to food and gas stations, that aggregates to $10 trillion a year. There has never been a $10 trillion a year shift in the history of economy. And it will happen faster than anyone believes. Why? Because this industry will tip on expectation, not on delivery. Banks will stop financing cars. Leasing companies will not be able to raise bonds. These changes will happen so fast on the expectation of global delivery, and all it takes is 1 country, 2 countries, 3 countries to prove that it happened. And after those first 2-3 sites have happened, there is not going to be a place in the world that will not want to go off petrol as fast as possible. That was a theory written on a paper in the middle of 2006. I handed it over to various different politicians and governments and car companies and oil companies, and by and large, oil companies would stop talking to me at that point in time. Car companies would look at me as if I was nuts. And politicians gave me it's great that the young generation is thinking about these problems. Until I got to the youngest politician in the world, Shimon Peres, president of Israel. And I presented this case in a closed forum, about 75 leaders, both the American administration and the US administration. And Paris jumped in the middle of my presentation, 6 minutes into my presentation. By the way, I was the counterpoint. I wasn't the point. The point was Daniel Yergin, who argued he's the most formidable, most knowledgeable person in the world about oil, who argued that oil is cheap and abundant. It will fluctuate, but it will always come back to cheap and abundant. I came up with the oil is going to die, and we're going to replace it before we run out of it. Here's how we do it. In the middle of my presentation, President Paris said, "Do you have anything written about this?" I gave him the white paper, expected the same, great the young generation. I was surprised to find out that there was a younger politician in office at 87 years old than I was. He called me up 2 days later and said, "Come to my office. We need to talk about this paper. You really thought this one through." And within 2 weeks, I went across the entire government. Every single office in government pretty much feels that they own this, including the Israeli Foreign Office now, because there have been 70 delegations to see the Israeli installations and systems that are being put in place in the last 6 months, more so than the Palestinian issue. And lots of industrialists in Israel. And after all these meetings for 2 weeks, I got to the Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Olmert at the time, and he told me the following thing. He said, "If you think that we'll give you money to build this thing, $200 million, you're absolutely wrong. But if you find $200 million somewhere else in the world, and you find a car company that's willing to build that car in volume, we'll give you a country where you can spend your money." President Paris thought that was a very, very fair deal. And we ended up actually going out and raising $200 million. I met with 200 different investors, potential investors, and about 10 of them put the $200 million, four of which put significant amounts. The other ones have put smaller amounts. I still claim that there are about 190 people in the world who think I'm absolutely nuts from these meetings. And we raised the capital. We met with a few car companies, and Renault actually stepped up and said, "We're going to build this car and put $1 billion into a lineup of cars and a factory for batteries." And the car is now there. We've started the installation. We've set it up in Israel. We announced 2 months later in Denmark, which was the second country where we're taking this to. And we announced a few months later here in Melbourne that Australia would be the third country. 2 reasons why Australia. One, up until Australia, we've been always pegged as the great plan to convert islands away, small islands, away from petrol to electric. We figured out if we do Australia, nobody's ever going to claim we went small. Second reason, Australia is actually a collection of transportation islands. Very, very dense, very sprawling, very long distance. Suburb to town, which is exactly the kind of driving you want to take out. Ends up that while everybody was focusing on the small urban driver who is very green and needs to project a great brand, self-brand, we call that guy Leo DiCaprio. He's the guy who has 2 electric cars. One of them takes him to the private jet. The focus actually needs to be the other 25%. It's Joe the plumber, Joe Sixpack, that drives from outside town, very, very far suburbs, into town, in traffic, every day, an hour to an hour and a half, and back. Those 25% of suburb, exurb commuters account for 66% of petrol usage in any country, including Australia. Take those guys off petrol, and you've solved the problem, literally solved the problem of oil dependence for Australia. In other words, 3 to 4 million drivers here would solve all of Australia's oil imports. And it can be done in less than a decade. So we figured out, this is a great idea, let's come do it. We also figured out Australia is on the long queue, on the worst side of the queue, of car-making countries. And there's a tremendous opportunity for the first countries that will come and adopt this technology, not just to be adopters, but also to become manufacturers and exporters of electric cars and batteries. Interestingly enough, what is a car battery? The best car battery today in the world is made of lithium, iron, and phosphate. I know a country that has lots of lithium iron phosphate, but actually exports it as lithium, iron, and phosphate. Instead of combining it into a powder and putting the powder on a piece of iron and collecting and cutting it in a manufacturing plant, and actually exporting it as kilometers. Oil. In other words, Australia could become effectively the next Saudi Arabia of cars, electric cars. Now, it's a race. The U.S. has put $2 billion and is about to put $2 billion more into electric batteries, electric car batteries. China is not waiting behind. They're putting the same amount of money to do the same thing. Korea's already done it. Japan, which used to be the leader in lithium-ion batteries, is not waiting behind. There's a huge race. All these guys know there will be an explosion in demand. And they're ramping up to the tune of about 3 to 4 million cars a year by 2012, and that race will become faster and faster. We need to get about 1 billion electric car batteries between now and the middle of the next decade, 2025. Why? Because every car in the world will be electric, somewhere around 25 to 2030. And 1 billion car batteries will need to be made. That's the biggest industrial opportunity in the world today. Australia can pick whether to be an exporter of iron ore, phosphate, lithium, or kilometers. It's a great choice. Has to be made fairly quickly. Same for the car industry. Can be a great importer of Toyotas and Nissans, or a great exporter of Australian Holden, not General Motors Holden. That's the choice today. By the way, when it's done, this solves the toughest emissions problem to solve. When done, just the car segment accounts, the private car segment accounts for 10% of CO2 emission and 100%, probably 100% of ground level pollution in cities. Ground level pollution in cities accounts for more deaths per year than car accidents. Take that out, and you've saved twice as many people as car accidents kill any given year in Australia. It also is the basis for a formation of a new industry around renewable generation of electrons that will take another 10% of the emissions just by creating a collection of batteries that can store intermittent generation at any point in time. So an integrated approach saves the economy, saves the car industry, creates exports, creates jobs, and all that by creating a new brand, in a sense, for leadership for countries that will go first. We came here because we thought this would be a great place to start. We found a great CEO in Evan. We've now filled in the team. We're ready to roll. This is going to be a great adventure. And we hope that all of you will become evangelists and help us in getting this done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shai Agassi, from the founder of Better Place. Now, Shai is lectern phobic. I'm lecturnophile. I like to stand behind the lectern and feel protected, but it makes it easier for me to see who's asking questions. We have 2 roving microphones. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Paola and Giorgio have got the microphone, so if you'd like to ask a question, please stick up your hand. Okay, first question right down here next to you, Giorgio. Please state your name and affiliation before you ask a question, and keep it tight.
Okay. My name's Anthony Joseph, independent consultant, ex-Microsoft. Ron Kogan, founder of the Green Car Journal, has said that the high price of batteries presents EVs from being an exclusive option for the future of transport. The battery is separated in the Better Place model, but still there's the price that has to be amortised. How do you address that concern?
So I think a lot of people have made the mistake of looking at the battery as a component. If we actually did the same thing with gasoline cars, the most expensive component of a gasoline car today is the oil, is the gasoline. Accounted for 15 years worth of spending, you're buying a $20,000 device with $40,000 consumable in it. Now, unfortunately with that consumable, if you could lock the price today, it would be $40,000. But if you really look at the projected price down the road, you're buying into $100,000 worth of petrol over the next 15 years. So we need to do a true assessment. Cost per kilometer, not cost to buy. cost per kilometer, batteries are cheap compared to crude oil today. And there's an inherent magic in batteries and crude oil. The next barrel of oil is always more expensive. The next battery is always cheaper. So you've got two curves, two trends. And coming from the same industries I grew up in, nobody ever wants to bet against Moore's Law, right? We're already on the other side of the Moore's Law in the sense that it's like transistors. When we figured out that they're better than a vacuum tube, they were already better. I mean, whereas with transistors, we started when they were worse. In this case, we figured it out only when they were better. We could have done this solution 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and still be better than crude oil. Now, if somebody makes the mistake of assessing batteries as components, they've made a wrong assessment. It doesn't mean that they made a right assumption.
Okay, question up the back.
Yes, I'm Hans Baer, an academic at Melbourne University, and I can certainly see a place for the electric car that you're talking about. But on the other hand, around the world, cities are getting increasingly congested. And my fear is that the electric car might deter people from turning to mass transportation, or I might say public transportation, which we need desperately in Melbourne. So would it not be better in large cities and even medium-sized cities to focus more on developing good public transportation and think about things like the electric car for more remote communities, let's say small towns? Even in cities of, let's say, 50,000, you can have fairly good public transportation.
Yeah, I think it's an admirable request to ask people to give up on their convenience, and I would love that more than anything else. It would have made my life easier if I could actually resolve things by saying we will abolish cars and we will make everybody go through public transport. The issue is we're not saying don't do public transport. The only thing we're saying is if you do public transport, please do it electric as well, so that it also creates no emissions as you do it. Now, the more public transport is done by government, the more demand you will see for cars, whatever car model it is. Reason being, the more public transport, the more people at the edge of the decision between private and public go on public transport, and then it becomes less congested, and then more people buy cars. What we've seen time and time and time again, it's not a question of do I exercise or diet, it's the answer of do both. We have to do both public transport and zero-emission cars in order to resolve this problem.
Okay, go with the glasses just down here. Yep.
Hello, Enlai Hui, I'm a student. Australia still produces most of its electricity using black coal, and China is starting to produce most of its electricity using brown coal. Now, I suppose an important question would be, how many watts per kilometre does this car actually do? And what does that equate to in terms of greenhouse emissions if we don't change our electricity provision strategy?
So one of the great things about electricity is you have a menu of options from which to pick. The menu has price, and you can choose which one you want to pick. Better Place picked clean, renewable electricity. In other words, whenever we put 1,000 cars on the road, you'll see us put a megawatt of wind in a contract that we'll buy from suppliers like AGL, for example. The entire Danish population will drive on 750 windmills. The Israeli population will drive on 2 megawatt of solar in the desert. When you have this opportunity to actually create another source of energy, which is conversion of photons effectively, into driving, into kilometers, then you can choose whether you want to do it in the right way or the wrong way. Now, we're not going to replace every power plant in Australia, and all we need, if the entire population of Australia went to electric cars, is about 8% of generation from renewable sources. So if I came to you and said, we will add 1% of generation every year for the next decade, you'd say, well, that's uninspiring. But that 1% of generation will do two things. We will buy that 1% every year at a higher price in the beginning than the cost of marginal coal-based cost. In other words, the cost difference for us is about between 1 cent and 2 cents per kilometer. 1 cent being coal, 2 cents being renewable. That price will go down as we bring in more and more and more cars because, again, unlike fossil fuel, the more clean generation is done, the cheaper and cheaper and cheaper it gets. By the time we are out of the market, by the time this 8% has been done, we've created such a massive adoption that the price of the marginal generation will be cheaper than coal, even for home consumption.
So we'll have to take
The
another
rise
question.
in electricity is that 8%. Now, here's the thing. We do something magical. We have a massive amount of batteries that are practically parked 22 hours a day. If you have an intermittent generation capacity, such as a windmill or such as a solar plant, you need a place to store no matter when the power came. And not a lot of people like to watch football in the middle of the night and have their TV go on, off, on, off, on, off based on wind, right? So what you have is a situation where if you have a lot of storage, you can take all the electricity whenever it comes. That's the beauty of adding so much power on the grid and so much storage on the grid. With that storage on the grid, we can do something else, and that is when you get to the peak hours, when air conditioners are on and everything is really, really tough, you can revert the flow, and for about half an hour, use the power in the batteries to feed back into the grid, which is done about 20, 30 times a year for this 1 hour. But you don't turn on the worst, most polluting power plants, and more cars come on. Every 50,000 cars that come on is 1 gigawatt. It's like one plant taken off the grid. Okay? The value for electric utilities usually love us because they take the worst plants off and they get the best electricity, and they have somebody who's willing to take electricity whenever they got it. Okay? It's the dream come true for utilities.
Okay, in the middle, up the back.
My name's Derek Ryan. I'm a retired physics teacher. My question is actually very similar to...
You got to speak closer to the microphone.
My question is very similar to the previous gentleman. The biggest problem I see is the ability of the grid to handle the electric load. We've already had blackouts in the last couple of years here because of line failures. And the other thing is the government at this stage is being pretty pathetic in encouraging the wind and the solar industry. And unless something drastic can be done to improve the uptake of wind turbines and solar, we're really going to place a heavy load on the coal-fired power stations.
Right, so two things you have to remember. One, we are actually sitting on the grid, but we're putting a lot of distributed batteries across the entire grid. When a cable falls in one place, the best thing that you can have is a bunch of electric cars parked on the other side of that cable that can actually feed emergency power to the teams that need it at that moment in time. Right? So you've got, for the first time, uninterrupted power supply sitting on the grid with a managed system, which is what we bring into the table, to manage who can actually give you that power and who can't, as well as who needs that power when you need it and who doesn't. We sort the entire queue of all parked cars into a queue of who needs power and who doesn't. And we shift the power back to the utilities to say how many cars can charge every 3 seconds. Now, the other part of the question of the adoption, we actually take the place of government in playing the role of subsidy for the industry. Why do we do it? It's in our interest to create a zero carbon footprint sticker on the car. We're basically thinking that if we come to the consumer and say this is coming from coal, we'll get all the questions you're asking us now. By the way, even with coal, we're improving on carbon footprint compared to gasoline, mainly because of efficiencies of the engine. But we don't want to even get to that question. We want to create a sticker that is absolutely zero. You go in this car, you know there is this absolute zero carbon footprint to driving. And we're willing to pay the extra cent per kilometer because we believe it's good for the consumer to actually have 1 less cent of margin, but have the sense that they're driving at zero carbon footprint. Now, it may sound crazy that there's a company that comes up and says, we'd rather lose a cent, but do the right thing. But if you look at it over a broader period of time, it is much more important for us to actually generate in the beginning and then end up 10 years from now with not only us using these electrons, but actually bringing the price down and having no price fluctuation on our cost. So it's not only a good sustainable business as far as the environment, it's good economics, is sustainability. Knowing predictably what the price would be, regardless of the price of coal, is a great opportunity for us to actually fix our business model for a long period of time.
Okay, question, yep.
Hello. Oh, look, my name is Peter Cohen. I'm an electrical engineer with my own business. I actually came here by electric tram. To have taken a car here from my place and looked for a parking spot would have been sheer stupidity. But I can think there's a lot of practical... I'm a sort of a very much nuts and bolts engineer. I can think of lots of practical difficulties which I'm sure you'll overcome, such as I park my car in the street, I can't very well run a power lead across the footpath.
You got to speak closer, I got to hear.
Oh, did you miss all the rest?
No,
just ask a question, please.
You're an electric engineer, you take a train and you have a lot of practical
As a nuts
questions.
and bolts engineer, I sort of think of all sorts of practical difficulties which can be resolved. But, for example, I park my car on the street. I couldn't run a power lead across the footpath. Council wouldn't allow it. I'd have to have a special plug alongside. It's a rented place. If I leave, someone doesn't need that lead. There, you can think of in shopping centres, you run a certain number of parking spots with power leads, with power points, but in an intermediate stage, someone drives into an electric car and you've got a whole lot of petrol cars taking up all the leads. All these little difficulties, batteries...
Can you ask the question, please, so we can get the answer?
So wondering what strategies you have sort of in mind for solving these bits, thousands of problems.
You're absolutely right. We solve 1,000 small problems every 3 months. We reintegrate the entire solution, not just hardware and software, but tools, policies, everything else that we learn every 3 to 4 months. What we call PRISM. We're now on the 4th or 5th PRISM. And we find out a lot of these small questions, right? Each one of them seems small, but I'll give you one that most people won't understand. How many spots do you connect into the car? How many charge spots are on the car, and where should they be located? Doesn't sound like something big to solve, but it ends up that if you don't have 2 spots and they're both in the front right and the front left, you need twice as much cost to install the network. Take it as homework. The general sense is that every one of these questions is huge. Now, what do we find out? There are different policies. Some cities actually come up and say, you know what, we will allocate 10% of our parking spots, much like we do for handicap parking, to electric cars. We'll paint them blue, we'll do whatever it takes. We'll put it there so that people actually know that they have a parking spot if they want to come. We'll do it in public parking, we'll do it on street parking. If they say so, we actually come in and we install. If they don't, we say, okay, in this city, we will only take customers who have a parking garage. And remember, we can't take 100% of the drivers on day one. Eventually, what will happen, and that usually happens after about 3 or 4% adoption in the country, we go out and we install every single parking spot, every roadside park, every single parking spot will be electric. In some places, it's part of the urban planning. Vancouver announced this week that you are no longer allowed to build a single apartment, not a single building, not a single new parking lot, without every single spot being electric. Why? Because they decided to. It's policy. The Chinese decide policies like that. I mean, for example, they decided you can't get into any urban center, Beijing, Shanghai, with your gasoline car every day, with a petrol car every day. You got to choose a day in the week, one of the 5 work days, in which you're not allowed to bring that car in. By 2012, it'll be 3 days. By 2014, it'll be disallowed. And at that point, you can pick an electric car or a bike. It's your choice. I mean, those are the kind of policies, and you can be very aggressive or very light. Now, we go through every one of these problems, the size of the battery, the fix, the motor. If you sat with us during one of our R&D meetings, you'll see that every meeting has 3 or 4 of these decisions. We go through them. We solve them. What's that? It's in Israel.
Okay, look, I'm sorry we can't take further questions. We've just run out of time. I'd like to invite Professor Chris Ryan to say a few words of thanks to our speaker, Shai Agassi.
Well, obviously, I want to thank Shai very much for his opening and such a spectacular opening for this series. I think, as I said at the beginning, as the series goes on, you'll see an echo of some of these issues. Shai talks about cars not being a commodity you buy, but buying kilometres, very much a service approach. He talks about what happens when you plug in batteries to a system and the system stops being a centralized, long, linear distribution system, and you end up with a distributed system which is much more resilient in the times of failure. I think also what I gained from the Better Place example and from listening to him again today is that it is possible, it is very possible to think of other ways in which the world can be constructed. which are much more sustainable and which can be without many of the problems we face today. Sometimes we find ourselves, in a sense, locked in by the enormous investment that we've had over the last 150 years or so of development with fossil fuels, and change can just seem so difficult. It is fantastic, I think, when we hear from projections of another way in which the system can operate, because it begins to open up the possibilities of innovation. And throughout these series, I hope that you'll hear other examples of that.
This is ABC Fora.